Assistant Professor in Arabic and Islamic Studies here at Georgetown University. I'd like to welcome you to our series where you get to meet scholars and hear them discuss their intellectual journeys. My guest today is Dr. Shawkat Toorawa, professor at Yale University. You can find his full biography on this page. Dr. Toorawa, welcome and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
So I'd like to have you start by maybe telling us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to your areas of research and study. It would just be a nice opportunity to get to know you a little bit better.
Happy to try and weave this narrative. So I suppose an important place to start is my birth, actually. I was born in London to parents from the island of Mauritius who met when they were in England. And life took them and therefore me from England through France and Hong Kong to Singapore, which is where I did all of my secondary schooling. And I went to a school called the United World College of Southeast Asia, which is part of an international movement of schools. And although it had sort of turned international, I did the international baccalaureate in high school. It was sort of UK looking. And so almost everyone ended up in the UK at universities in England or potentially Scotland. And one of my fateful decisions was to not go to the UK. As I was deciding what I would study or what I would do at university, and talked it over with my parents. At one point, I thought I would study law because I thought law might be interesting. And my mother said to me, "Why would you want to make a living telling lies?" Which quickly killed any interest I had in law. And then I thought, well, what am I good at? I'm pretty good at languages. I'm interested in literature. I was an avid reader, still am, although I read much less just because I'm less organized now. So I thought, well, what can I do and where can I go? And I learned, this was back in 1980, I learned that the United States was a place you could go to university and actually not decide what you were going to do. You could decide later. People didn't necessarily know. And I thought, well, this sounds great. Told my school, told my parents, and everyone was fine with it. And then I thought, well, how am I going to decide where to go, since there are 4,000 places you can go, unlike England, where there were a handful then, maybe 20. And I thought, okay, fine. Why don't I organize this around literature? What are literatures I'm interested in? So I was fascinated by French and Spanish literature, but I already knew French from having grown up in Paris, and my Spanish was already very good from having studied it at school. And I thought, what's the point of going and studying literature in a language I already know? I eliminated those and thought, well, I'm going to America. What can I study there? So one option was to study a Native American language. And I settled on Hopi. Not that I ever studied it, but that was in my thinking. And I then thought, well, I've always been interested in learning a language that's outside of the Romance family. So I thought, well, why not Arabic? And Arabic suggested itself to me because of my Muslim upbringing. So like so many non-Arabophone Muslims, I could read the Quran, but I could only understand those occasional words that came up in one or other place. So with Arabic and Hopi in mind, and then my mother or my father, I don't remember who, said, do you want to learn Gujarati? So we're actually ancestrally from Gujarat in India. And I thought, well, that'd be an interesting thing to learn since my parents never spoke it to me, even though they were fluent in it. They read, wrote, and spoke it. So I thought, okay, Gujarati, Arabic, and Hopi. So what I did is I went to the careers office in my school. This was pre-internet. And I tried to identify universities where I could study two or all three of those languages and apply to them. And one of them, and one I got into, was the University of Pennsylvania. So when I got into the University of Pennsylvania, I said to my parents, I think I want to go here. And some friends of ours inquired about it, and we were told that it was a reputable place and a good place to study. And I thought I should privilege one language, and I thought, well, why not Arabic? I picked up the phone, and from Singapore, I called a man called Roger Allen, who was in charge of Arabic. And I said, hello, Dr. Allen, my name is Shawkat Toorawa. I've been admitted to Penn. I'd like to come and study Arabic. And he said in his impeccable Oxford accent, come see me the moment you arrive. And so when I arrived in Philadelphia, also fateful because I had traveled alone a lot in my life, but I'd never been alone to college, obviously, or to the United States. I wrote to the Muslim Studies Association, and they told me they would send 2 people to pick me up at the airport. One of those persons was Sherman Jackson. And he's the one who took me to my dorm and got me settled, and he was one of my first friends there, earliest, yeah. And I went to see Roger Allen soon after, and I said, I don't know what I want to do in life or with my college degree, but I thought Arabic would be interesting. I thought Hopi would be interesting. I thought Gujarati would be interesting. And he said, don't waste your time learning Gujarati. You can learn that anytime you want because you're Gujarati. And the Hopi professor's on leave, Toorawa, the anthropology department, take Arabic. And I see you've pre-registered for Arabic, regular Arabic, 5 hours a week. Don't do that. Sign up for intensive Arabic and take it 10 hours a week. And so my freshman year, my first year in college, I was studying Arabic 10 hours a week and a few other courses, became enamored of Arabic and really became completely taken with Roger Allen. So he was this man who was this sort of short Englishman who would ride his bicycle into work every day and then teach classes. I didn't have him my first year on Arabic literature. And I thought, what a great thing to do with your life. So I went up to him several weeks into my freshman year and I said, how does one become like you? And he said, well, one takes a degree in Arabic, then goes and does a PhD in Arabic literature and then teaches at a university. And I said, well, that's what I'm going to do. And he said, it's a little early to decide that. And I said, it's my current plan. And I tell this story at length because it was a plan that got kind of buffeted and deflected along the way, but I did stick to it. So I did my undergraduate, I did a master's at Penn, even though I'd been advised by people I admire to change universities from undergrad to grad. Penn was really a powerhouse in the 80s, and I studied with George Makdisi and Roger Allen, Adil Alouche, and Edward Peters in medieval history. So I stayed there, and I decided to to work on modern literature, because literature had always been my passion. And the figure I seized on was Adonis, the great Syro-Lebanese poet. And the reason was because I was in a class with a couple of other people, myself, of course, and Roger Allen, and some students complained about him being difficult. And I got kind of annoyed at the idea that a poet could be difficult, and set about translating Adonis. And that translation, those early translation efforts, which later were published, turned into my master's thesis, turned into an idea about a dissertation. Around 7 years into this education, I divulged to Roger Allen that this was a lot of schooling, continuous schooling since the age of 4, and I needed a break, committed as I was to this. And he said, well, just apply for a fellowship and go somewhere and don't do anything. And so I applied for a fellowship, went to Cairo and didn't do anything. I'm not sure I didn't do anything. I read a lot of African literature. I wrote an article on Mahfouz. I wrote an article on Tayyib Saleh. You know, I kind of did things that I wanted to do. And I studied the influence of Adonis on the modern generation then of poets. But my department was uneasy with my plan to study or to write a thesis about one collection. So I had decided at this point that I would write a doctoral thesis on the collection Waqt Bain al-Ramad wal-Ward, Time Between Ashes and Roses by Adonis. And they were uneasy, and I can't know for sure, but I think one reason was my department was unaccustomed to people studying living people. Adonis was and still is alive. And the other was to just focus on just this one collection, as opposed to Adonis, the poet, in the context of Syria or the modern Middle East or modern Arabic literature. And my response to this was to say, A, if this were T.S. Eliot and 4 quartets, you would not have this problem. And B, I think I'll just study the Middle Ages instead. And I switched. So I came back from Cairo with the plan to change topics, but I also had a job. So I had visited the US during my Cairo year to give a paper, and Roger Allen said, can you go down to Duke University? Miriam Cook wants to see you. And I had heard that name, and I went down to Duke and interviewed, but I did not know it was for a job. I thought it was for a summer job. And eventually I was offered this. And so when I came back from Cairo, I did not go back to Penn. I went to Duke, but I had changed doctoral thesis topics and didn't really have one anymore, having abandoned Adonis. So I went back to Philadelphia, and I went to see George Makdisi, who was my mentor. And I said, I've decided not to work on Adonis. What should I work on? And he said, well, I'm not going to tell you what to work on. You have to decide what to work on. So I said, well, how do I decide? And he said, well, you don't have any ideas? And I said, no, I have like 85 ideas. That's the problem. And he said, okay, here's what you do. Go and read Setzgin's Geschichte des arabischen Schriftums, volumes 1 and 2, and identify 4 people who you find interesting. So I went and read this famous resource in our field of all the manuscripts that are available until the year 1010, and I identified 4 people. I no longer remember who those 4 people are. I only remember 3 of them. Al-Madaini, the great antiquarian, Yahya ibn Ma'in, the hadith scholar, and Ibn Abi Tahir Tayfur. This person that I had not really heard of, I must have seen his name in sources, but one of whose manuscripts was called Balaghat al-Nisa, the eloquence of women, or the eloquent witticisms of women, which captured my attention, and a 4th that I don't recall. And I went to see Maqdisi and I said, here are the 4 names. And he said, Al-Madaini, not enough material. Yahya ibn Ma'in, someone's working on him in Germany. I don't remember the 3rd, as I said, and the 4th, he said, Ibn Abi Tahir. Now, Ibn Abi Tahir is interesting because Ibn Durayd once said, if the 4 people you should read are Jahiz ibn Qutayba, Al-Qali, and Ibn Abi Tahir, go work out why he would have said that. And so I went away, to Duke, started teaching there, teaching Arabic, and really embarking on my doctoral work. Learned everything I could about Ibn Abi Tahir, and then sort of life happened for various reasons that have to do with family. Good reasons, and then later bad reasons. Bad in the sense it was my mother's health. I moved to Malaysia. So I had to resign from Duke and mid or early dissertation, and lived in Malaysia. Nice things happened too. I got married that year and worked for the family business, and wondered whether I would ever finish my dissertation, and said to my father, I have no hesitation, had no hesitation resigning and coming and helping out, which is what you needed, because that's the correct thing to do. But to the extent that I can, I'd like to finish my PhD. It's not so much that I want to become a professor, it's that I want to finish the doctoral thesis, because it's something that I started and that I enjoy. And so a year later, I came back to the States with my wife, and tried to finish. And again, life happened, and we moved to the island of Mauritius, which is where my family was from, because of my mother's ailing health. And I got a job at the University of Mauritius, and I tried to finish my dissertation from there. I eventually succeeded in completing the dissertation, and in 1998, so this is now 17 years after I went to college, I defended my thesis on a medieval bookseller who lived in the 9th century called Ibn Abi Tahir. And the big question that the dissertation asked was provoked by a statement that Roger Allen made, because Roger Allen was still on my dissertation committee. That is, he was still one of my teachers. I sent a huge bunch of material by mail to the US from Mauritius, about 450 pages. And I got a letter back from Roger Allen that said, I've just read everything that you've written, and I'm not sure it was time well spent. And then he said, here's the thing. What's the big question? This is all fascinating information about this man, Ibn Abi Tahir. But what's the big question? So I scratched my head, and my supervisor, who was no longer George Maqdisi because he'd retired, but was now Everett Rowson, the great Everett Rowson, had the same question for me, posed in a different way. What's your point? What are you trying to say? So I scratched my head and I read this material over and over and over again until an idea began to emerge. And the idea eventually became the thesis and my book, which was there a shift? And if there was, what did it look like between a time when people were more invested in scholarly transmission and in a world of orality to one that was more tied to books? So my book subtitle is a 9th century bookman in Baghdad. And I became interested in what I termed writerly culture. And at the time, when I started using that phrase, all my friends and colleagues teased me about it and said it was a mouthful, which it is. But to my, I wouldn't say to my credit, but I would say heartwarmingly, that term has now become much more widely used in scholarship in our field, writerly culture, as a way of capturing what this term adab, at least in the 9th century, is supposed to capture, a kind of literariness of some kind. So that seemed to be where my brain was going and where my research was going. But I was kind of irrepressibly interested in literature generally. I was always interested in literature. And one of the things that happened when I was in Mauritius, in the 3 years that I was teaching at the University of Mauritius, I was not teaching in our field. I was teaching Indian Ocean Studies. I was teaching modern British poetry, medieval French literature, teaching whatever the university needed me to teach in the humanities department. I was also realizing that I did not know whether I would ever come back to the States or go anywhere and become an academic in my field. I just knew I wanted to finish the dissertation. I thought I should start doing things that make sense to do in Mauritius. And one of those things was Mauritian literature, which I thought was understudied. And it still is, but much more studied now than then. And so I thereby became something of an expert, I guess, in pre-modern Indian Ocean studies and in Mauritian literature in Creole and English, because there's a lot of study of Mauritian literature in French. One of the things that I discovered when reading about Mauritius in a pre-European, pre-modern period is that it was a candidate for being the island of Wak Wak. And so this Wak Wak Islands are these legendary islands that you read about in Arabic geographical, cosmographical, and other sources, the Arabian Nights, for example, which is supposed to be far away and in the distance somewhere. And many wild and wondrous things are associated with them. The islands populated by women, women growing on trees, wondrous birds, any number of things. And so I began to do that. And I mention this because it's somewhat significant, because I wrote to, and this will be relevant to Professor Omar, I wrote to Wolfhard Heinrichs at Harvard, and I said, I have this idea about writing a few articles for the Encyclopedia of Islam to remain connected to the field, because I was in Mauritius. And he said, well, you know, what do you have in mind? And so I wrote a piece on sikbaj, which is a kind of stew. And I wrote a piece about Tahir ibn Muhammad, who was the great-grandson of the person I'd studied, Ibn Abi Tahir. But little did I know that a few years later, I would be actually in Cambridge, Massachusetts for a year on a fellowship and writing the article on Wak Wak, or I should say revising the article on Wak Wak. It's this massive article in the Encyclopedia of Islam that I revised. And you know, one of the things that I realized, which I should have realized right away, but I realized later, is even the stint in Mauritius, which one can think of as having been an interruption, you know, there are always ways of making the best of what is going on. I mean, I wasn't unhappy, but making the best of what was going on in terms of my field. And by simply pursuing Wak Wak, I eventually ended up writing, and I'm still, because we haven't reached W yet in the Encyclopedia of Islam 3, right? I'm still the authority on Wak Wak. And just 2 days ago, someone asked me for a copy of the article, and just recently someone mentioned it in a Twitter statement. So yeah, you know, so one of the, not only is it something that I realized, but kind of a point that I always like to share, is that one should never underestimate the impact and the value of anything that one does. And I think it accounts for something that Professor Omar and I have talked about, which is that I worked on a lot of different things and they're very disparate. And partly, or some of them, are things like this, where I happened to be in Mauritius and it seemed to make sense to try and explore that. Another example of that is when I was teaching a class at Cornell University, where I ended up and where I spent most of my career. And so for which I'm forever grateful, because it was a wonderful department and a wonderful time. 16 years, and where we raised our daughters. I taught a class called New York, Paris, Baghdad, on modern Arabic poetry, modern world poetry from those places. And was disappointed in some anthologies of New York poetry. And in one of the classes, my students, many of whom were graduate students, were equally disappointed. And so we abandoned the idea of a final paper and decided to produce our own anthology, which is what we did as a project, as a class. And then when the class was over, the director of the museum at Cornell said to me, because we used to go there for coffee before class, said, you know, why don't you sort of put your money where your mouth is and actually produce an anthology of New York poetry? And so one of the things that I've done recently is, in fact, produced an anthology of New York poetry called The City That Never Sleeps. Like the Adonis translations that I published, which took me 14 publishers before I found one. New York poetry also took me 14 publishers before I found one. But the lesson in this is to never let go of one's instincts and passions and to pursue them. And so in a way, I'm aberrant in the field in that I don't necessarily work in just one thing, but I think it's a wise way to proceed.
Wow. Well, thank you for that, Dr. Toorawa, and thank you for contextualizing for us, you know, some of the work that you've done. It's been really a pleasure having you, and yeah, such a delight. So thank you so much for being with us.
Not at all.